Okay, well, we're here to tell you about a tool that we built for end-to-end testing in React Native called Cavy. We think it's kind of cool. Hopefully you will as well by the end of this. But first, just a little bit about us. My name is David. I'm the head of engineering at a company called Pixie. We're a software development agency based just down the road, actually. It was a very easy walk here today.
And my name is Abigail, and I'm also a software developer at Pixie Labs, working with David.
Cool, that was easy. So we're going to tell you a little bit about what Cavy is and why we think that you need it. And we'll tell you a little bit about how we built it and kind of how it works. And then if the demo gods are on our side, then we're going to do a little bit of live coding, which should be fun. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of plans we've got for the future as well, and sort of where we're kind of going with it. I drew the short straw for the live demo this time, so Abigail gets to talk to you about Cavy instead.
Cool, so first off, what is Cavy? This guy is Cavy. And before anybody asks, he's not supposed to be a bear, he's supposed to be some kind of capybara-esque creature. I am not a designer and I got tasked with making this logo, so we're stuck with this slightly creepy death stare capybara thing. Anyway, we're going with it. And we've got badges, so anyway. Cavy was kind of born out of our belief that there must be some kind of simple and clean solution to testing multiple React Native components. And that's what Cavy is. So it's end-to-end, it's open source, and it doesn't touch any native code. So because it doesn't touch any native code, it's exactly the same on Android and iOS. So you set up your tests once, you write one set of tests, and it works exactly the same, cross-platform. You can also run your tests in a simulator, on a real device, and crucially, in a CI environment, which is something that we're really after. So why do we need Cavy? I might not convince those who think testing is just a waste of time anyway, but yeah, aren't there already enough testing frameworks out there already? So let's start with what is it out there. So for unit testing at Pixie Labs, we use Jest. So how many of you have used Jest before? Yeah, it's the one, right? So Jest is like the recommended testing framework for React Native. So it comes with a full like mocking support, a search and library, everything, test runner. And it also allows you to do snapshot testing, which is really cool for React Native. And snapshot testing is where it takes captures a JSON representation of your app in a specified state, and then you compare it to one that you've taken earlier, and if there's any differences, then you decide whether that is an actual regression error or whether that was an actual change that you made to your app. We also use Enzyme at Pixie Labs, which is another JavaScript testing framework. And it can be used with Jest, and it gives you the ability to shallow render components. So again, it's unit testing. It kind of just allows you to test that the correct components are being rendered at that time. So these are all great tools for unit testing. All can be used in CI, but again, all just like unit testing components of your app. So what about end-to-end testing? Unlike unit testing, when we were developing with React Native, it was a lot harder to decide what kind of end-to-end testing framework we should go with. There are a couple of things out there, and the first one that we looked into was Appium. We found the overhead for setting up Appium to be quite large. It also uses native hooks to access the components in your app, so it doesn't work identically cross-platform. You have to set it up twice. Once for iOS, once for Android, and it needs some knowledge of native code. And as JavaScript developers, we were like, nah. So the same for Calabash and Cucumber. They actually allow you to write really nice human-readable specs. But again, it does use native hooks to access your components. So it's Calabash iOS, Calabash Android, different setups for each platform. So whereas Appium and Calabash, they were designed to test native apps, the last one we looked at was Detox, and that was actually specifically, or more designed to be used with React Native. But Detox doesn't actually support Android yet, which is a bit of a blow. And you can't run it on devices. So it also still uses a native component. So there's 2 setups for that as well. So not finding anything that we were particularly happy with, we felt that there was a gap in the React Native testing ecosystem. And we gave ourselves 1 week of dev time to come up with something better, and hence Cavy was born. So yeah, we think Cavy is pretty cool, and so do a couple of other people too. And actually, we already know of companies that are using it in their production code, like not including ourselves, which is cool. So just before we get onto the demo, I want to go through a little bit of how Cavy works behind the scenes. And actually, it's quite simple. So there's just like 3 main components that you need to set up. So first of all, they are these things that we're going to refer to as the test hooks. And you attach these to your components that you want to access and manipulate in your tests. And to do this, Cavy provides you with this ref generating function, generate test hook. And to hook up your components, you just pass this in to the ref, and it takes a string identifier. So anything you want to be able to refer to in your tests, say we'll be able to call scene.input. So Cavy adds this reference that you've given it together with the component itself into what we call the test hook store. And that's basically where all the components are stored for access later on in your tests. So second of all, you get some helper functions. And if any of you are familiar with like Jasmine or Waka or RSpec, these are going to look super similar to that. So at the moment, we've kind of focused on ones that we thought were most useful and the ones that we come across most often when we are testing our app. So for example, like this would be your spec file. So you're describing my feature, you're testing that it works by filling in a text input with hello, pressing a scene button, and expecting some kind of next scene to exist. So there are all the references that we've previously hooked up our components with. So yeah, it's actually quite simple to also create your own helper functions if you needed them. So if you needed like a swipe or something, Cavy allows you to create those yourselves, custom functions. So the third thing that you need to be aware of is the wrapper component. And this is probably the most kind of abstract part of Cavy, but really all it does is, well, it kind of just brings everything together. So you can see here it's imported as tester at the top from Cavy, and you basically wrap your entire app in this tester component at the highest level. So you can see here tester is wrapping my app, which is at the highest level. And the most important thing that the tester does really was a couple of things is it automatically runs your tests. So here it's passed in as an array, your app spec, you've got info app spec from your specs folder, passed into the tester component as an array of specs, and tester will allow those to be run. The tester also makes the test hook store, so that was the store of components alongside their refs available to your app. So here you can see test hook store being imported from Cavy and passed into the tester component as a prop. So lastly, how do we run the thing? So as I just said, the tester component means that your tests are run by default when your app boots. But there's also something we've made called Cavy CLI, so command line interface, which you can also use to run your tests locally. But crucially, you can also run it in your CI environment. So you can use Cavy CLI in your test script for Circle CI, for example. So without further ado, I will hand over for David for the demo.
You get to hold my mic though.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't plan for having like a handheld mic rather than a lapel mic, so this could be awkward.
Or one-handed coding, you could try.
Yeah, I could try. Okay, so can everyone see that okay? I know that the simulator's a little bit small, but I can't remember how to make the simulator bigger. So we've got this tiny little app, which is kind of like a sample app that we use for Cavy. And imagine this is kind of like an employee list, but actually all my employees are Cavys. And I can filter this list, so I can search for someone. I can tap on an employee, and then when I do, I can see some actions to go and email that Cavy, and see also the people that report to them. So just kind of like a little sample app, essentially. And this is cool, but now we want to test this, right? We want to see if this, we want to have some tests to make sure that this app works. I mean, it's fairly obvious it works, but let's just go with it here. So the first thing we need to do is just go ahead and add Cavy as a dependency. And there's no need to do any kind of thanks, Babel. There's no need to do any kind of React Native link. It's just JavaScript. There's no native components of this at all. So now the first thing we need to do is we need to wrap our app in that tester component. So just for those that aren't super familiar with sort of React Native file structure, is that visible up there? Can everyone see? Is it, yeah, all good? All good at the back? Great. So we've got a couple of folders that for the native code in a React Native app, so the Android folder and the iOS folder. We won't be doing anything with those. Woohoo! Then we've got an app folder, which is where our actual app's JavaScript is. So things like our actual React components. Then we've got the index.js, and that's the entry point, right, for our app. And this is the first JavaScript file that React Native is going to load when that app boots. And so this is where we need to wrap our app in the tester component from Cavy. I've got notes so that I try not to screw this up. So first of all, we need to import that tester and test hook store. If I make any typos, then just heckle me. So that I know that I've done something wrong. So I'm going to import the tester and test hook store from Cavy. I'm going to make a new test hook store. And then I also need to import React, because we don't actually have a React component in here yet. Whoop, nearly. All right. And now we need to make a small little app wrapper here. Oh, where's my escape button? There it is. So I'm going to make an app wrapper. And yeah, this is going to wrap my app in the tester component. So for now, because we haven't got any specs yet, I'm just going to pass in an empty array. And then I'm going to, oh, was that a typo? Heckle? Oh, yeah, no, you're right. Yep. Excellent, thank you. Perfect. And then I need to pass in my instance of the test hook store. And for there's a bunch of other props that Cavy gives you. I'm going to use the wait time one here, which just pauses between each test run, just kind of for demo purposes, because otherwise it goes a little quick. And then I'm going to render that, my actual app, the employee directory app. Great. And then I just need to change this app registry line. I don't know if you've only used create React Native app or Expo, you may not have done stuff with the app registry kind of thing. It's basically just a way of registering the app and indicating to the native layer that this is your kind of entry point for the app. So I just need to change that to, instead of being our app, it's now this wrapper. And then in theory, nothing should change, and the app will still work. Great. So everything is still exactly the same. And so now we need to decide what do we want to test. So let's say that we want to test that filtering this employee list works. I can type something into the search bar and it changes what is listed. And then I can test that tapping on an employee shows the email button. So what I need to do is I need to go and find those components, and I need to add them as a hook. I need to hook them in so that they're available in that test hook store and available in my specs. So I'll go and do the search bar. So if we go and find the search bar here, and the first thing I need to do is I need to import hook from Cavy. And that's Cavy's kind of higher order component. that makes the test hook store available and gives you that generate test hook function. And then we want to interact with the text input down here. So I'm going to add a ref, and I'm going to pass in our ref generating function, and then I can give it an identifier that I'm going to use in my test. And that can be anything. It's just a string. You can use any kind of convention you want. In this case, I'm going to say search bar.text input. And then at the end of my component, I just need to export the wrapped version of search bar instead of the original component. So that's one. I would also need to do the employee list item so that I can tap on an employee get Cavy in the list. And I also need to hook up that email button so that I can see that it's there. I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit here and not type all of that out. Great, done. So now, if we go and have a look in this employee list item, for example, you can now see we've got a this props generate test hook. I'm doing kind of a weird thing here to keep things simple. I'm making a synthetic like test ID from the first name and last name of the Cavy so that I can identify a particular one on the screen and interact with that specific one. You could really do whatever you wanted there. And then there's also the same in the action bar. So where's that email button? Here it is. So we've got the email button here, a little image and a piece of text. And that's also got a generate test hook here, action bar.email button. All right. Where are we up to? OK, so now we've wrapped our app in the tester kind of abstract component. We've hooked up the components that we want to interact with in our tests. So the next step is to write our tests. So I'm going to make a specs folder. And then in there, I'm going to add an employee list spec. And this is going to look quite a lot like Abigail's example, not a capital E. So these are just functions that Cavy is going to run for us. And I'm going to say that when I list the employees, it filters the list by search input. So all of your specs are like async. You can use async and await. And the reason for that is obviously to avoid some of the callback soup. And because Cavy is going to wait for each, it's going to give a little bit of time for your app to render or for elements to appear and stuff like that. If you've ever done any kind of like feature tests where you've been interacting with a website, it's fairly standard that a test framework is going to wait a little bit for something to happen before it gives up looking for a component or pressing a button or whatever. So all of these calls are prefaced with await. So I'm going to check first of all that. Where are we? Employee list. I'm going to check first that Jim Cavy is on the screen. And then I'm going to fill in my text input with Amy. And then I'm going to check that that Jim Cavy is now no longer on the screen. And then I'm going to check that Amy still is. OK. So I've written my first little test. And now I need to go back to my tester and add that as one of the specs to run to the tester component. So I'm going to import. I'm going to import my employee list spec. Try saying that fast. And then I'm going to add that as one of my specs. OK, and then in theory, if I've not made any mistakes and no one's said anything, then when I reload the app, Cavy is going to boot up, and then it's going to run that test. And you can it's kind of quick there. So I'm just going to do that again. You can see it's typing in Amy into the search bar and then checking that the elements have appeared or disappeared. And then in the console, we can see that it's reporting, yep, everything's cool. And just to show that this isn't complete smoke and mirrors and it doesn't always pass, I'm going to write another test. And and I'm going to do the, not in describe, actually, yeah. I'm going to test that email button appears when you transition from one view to the next. So let's say tapping on an employee, it shows the email button. So I'm going to say, what was it? Is it press? This is why I wrote it down. So I'm going to press on the Amy Taylor entry in the employee list, and then I'm going to pause for a moment, and then I'm going to check that that action bar email button. But I'm going to make a typo, so I'm going to accidentally put email butto. And then if we run this again, does that look right? Or does anyone think I've made a mistake? Apart from the typo. Okay, no one's saying anything. So if I run this again, then we can see that it runs that first test, it resets the app, it runs the second test, but then now we get an error, and it says that it couldn't find a component on the screen with that identifier, action bar email butto. So I can go and fix that, and run it again. And hurrah! Whoop! I have successfully tested my app. I'm a successful developer. So it's kind of like a quick whistle-stop demo of Cavy. This would have also worked on Android as well, because it's just JavaScript, right? There's no native component. There's nothing kind of weird going on. So everything would have worked in Android as well. And also, again, don't have time to demo it, but it does also work in a continuous integration environment. We've actually got, is that visible? I don't know. You can imagine if you've used Circle CI, you know what this looks like. It's a passing Circle CI build where this is actually testing Cavy itself. So this is using a sample app to make sure that any changes that we make to Cavy, everything still works okay and all of the tests still pass. So you can see this is actually a very simple config. If I just swap to the config a second, that's a little bit small. Let me make that bigger. This config is actually a little bit more complex than it needs to be because it's testing a local version of Cavy within the repository. But you can see all it's doing is just installing the dependencies, it's installing the sample app dependencies, and then it's just running at the bottom here, Cavy run iOS. And then if we go back to the test summary and we look at that final command, then we can see that right at the bottom here, after compiling the app, it's then launching it, and then it basically listens for the test results. So Cavy kind of expects there to be a sort of test server waiting for the responses. And then when it receives it, it then outputs it for the test log. And also, if it was successful or not successful, then it would output with the correct error code. So that's Cavy. That's what it looks like. And so now back to Abigail to talk a little bit about the sort of future plans for Cavy.
All right, so where is Cavy going next? So first of all, I want to talk about report generation. So as you saw in the demo, Cavy kind of simply outputs the results to the console. And when running Cavy CLI, it just uses the exit code, whether all the tests failed or passed, and then you see the kind of same console log at the end. So what we'd really love to do is to add proper test reporting output so that your CI environment has kind of a richer view of which tests failed and passed. So that's that. And the second thing is conditional test running. So obviously you saw when you boot your app, the tests run by default, which is not ideal for production. And there are like a multitude of different ways that you could handle that yourself by configuring it to run differently in different environments. But we really wanted that to be part of Cavy itself, so you don't have to do that manually. Next up, accessibility IDs. So what makes the kind of native testing frameworks really good is that they can use accessibility IDs to access the components. So that means you can just drop test IDs into your code rather than putting in like generate test hook and passing in strings or whatever. It's a lot less intrusive than that. So unfortunately, we can't use these as React Native doesn't make accessibility IDs available to the JavaScript. But there is like an open issue on React Native to make that actually a thing. So we're hopeful that in the future we would be able to use these as well. Lastly, other platforms. So React Native is gaining support in other environments as well, with things like React Native Web and React Native Windows. And in theory, like you can use Cavy with any of these things, but we don't like specifically support that yet in Cavy CLI. So that's just another thing sort of on our roadmap to look at. And so yeah, lastly, like we do have like a little roadmap on our GitHub. So if any of you lovely guys would like to, try to hand us some open source software, we'd really appreciate some help. Yeah, we're like a friendly open source team. So yeah, it'd be great to like work with any one of you in that.
All right. Thanks everyone.